Hello, I'm Rupert,
I'm Adam.
and this is going to be the internally screening review of Soul, directed by Pete Docter. I think he was the guy who did Inside Out. I'm not sure which other ones, but this film's very Inside Out-ish to me. It's almost like a kind of spiritual successor. Pun not intended, but that's actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's very visually similar. The kind of themes of introspection, going to like a different place. Say in Inside Out, they go inside someone's mind and they see like the characters that exist inside. This is almost like the inverse of that, where you have someone who dies very early on in a very sudden way. They sort of have this outer body experience where they go to the great beyond, and then they travel to this place, the great before. And both films, in having that setup and having that kind of structure, attempt to kind of analyze some element of the human condition. And I think it's a really interesting sort of duo of films in that regard. Pixar are generally incredibly good at coming up with creative concepts in order to sort of explore themes that, you know, other animated films don't normally touch on. Like, this is a pretty serious film in terms of its grand messages and its sort of the things it attempts to tackle. There's a lot of mental health stuff in this film. There's a lot of stuff about like being crushed by the weight of the world, not being able to fulfill your dreams. It can be very viscerally kind of depressing in its way.
Yeah, I mean, how many kids films, I might be missing some obvious examples here, but how many kids films have we had that sort of narratively based around a guy having a midlife crisis?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, so explicitly. Like, well, I mean, to be fair, The Incredibles is kind of like that, but the midlife crisis is kind of like implied, and it's not like the literal text of the film, right? Because it's kind of, the midlife crisis is like an implied metaphor using the superpowers thing as like a real exciting component to that, whereas this is literally just like, this guy is upset with his life. Like, it's like so intensely about that. And I do kind of, I do respect that. I mean, I have the feeling I probably like this film a lot less than most people like it, which I'll get into, but I do have a lot of respect for it, for how absolutely wild and kind of like abstract it gets at points. Because I've heard someone describe specifically this film, but Pixar films in general, as kind of being not just for kids but not just for adults either. It's got that kind of accessibility to it where it's not like Trolls World Tour or something where the adults are just kind of putting it on and like they're like, thank God this isn't like another episode of Paw Patrol or whatever. Like,
just to placate the kids, like a pacifier.
It's not, it's not
fodder,
a pacifier.
It's bright colours and that's it.
There's a lot to sit down and digest here. Like, it's not just a disposable kids film, and I do really appreciate that, because, you know, kids are much smarter than they get credit for a lot of the time, and this kind of stuff is actually going to be quite thought-provoking while also being massively marketable. One of the best things about this film, I mean, I almost feel stupid saying it in a review of Pixar at this point, because the animation's really good and the design is really creative and interesting. What I also found kind of wild about this film is that like some of the animation felt like specifically inspired from like abstract art, like the characters in the Great Before, where they kind of look like Picasso paintings with like the weird lines.
I was gonna say,
always in 2D. It's kind of like, it's such a wild concept to put that in like a kids film, because they're not going to get that reference.
I think that's what's specific about this film, is Pixar, like you say, always have, you know, really distinct, fantastic, genre leading animation quality, but this film sets itself apart with how creative it is. To come off that point, like the kind of children, the souls, there's this weird like hazy like edges to them where they you can't actually see like the defined edge of any of these little orbs. They kind of like fuzz out, like there's like a strange camera filter on it. And again, like there's that idea of like babies not having like proper memories. Everything is through like this sort of rose tinted lens, like all your memories as a child are so like bright and fleeting. Like it kind of had that element into it, and that's just such like a wonderfully specific detail that sets it apart from like any other animated film you would ever have seen.
My favorite animation aspect of this film, though, I did like the moments in the Great Beyond, but they honestly, they were kind of frustrating to me in a way, because again, in the setup, Jamie Foxx's character Joe dies early on in the film and we go to the Great Before, which was kind of disappointing to me, because I was really enjoying like the amount of detail and atmosphere in like the New York. I was really enjoying that. Like, it had like a real detail to it and like atmosphere to it. I mean, I've never been to New York, but it seemed to be very authentic to me, so I was a little disappointed that we didn't get more time in New York. When he died early on, I was thinking like, oh god, is this going to be like the rest of the film? Are we ever going to get back back to New York, or like are we going to get like any time? And thankfully, like there is some more, but yeah, I felt like maybe
you kind of hoped that the balance would be more towards New York than the other stuff.
Do you not think like the initial setup, it could have been a little bit more impactful if you had more time with the main character before he accidentally dies?
Yeah, quite possibly. But then again, I think there's something to be said for that in terms of like the film's themes of not living up to your potential, or like feeling like life has kind of passed you by. The idea that you die, like your main character dies immediately, and they're miserable because of it. Or they're miserable because they just had their opportunity, and if like life is in a cruel joke, it's taken it all away. I think having it fleeting kind of reinforces that element, perhaps. I can see where you're coming from though, because when I agree, like I wanted more from New York and I was worried, and then they brought it back and I was satisfied. Once it kind of, the next phase of the story started, I was satisfied with what we got, you know, like in terms of being submerged in that environment. But I think something else based off on that environment, and just to sort of finish off talking about the animation, is I'm amazed at the detail in like all the performances, like because Joe is a pianist, and the specificity and the detail in like all the notes he plays, and then you got like drummers drumming, they've animated it all perfectly. So often animations shy away from that, and they half-arse it, and they have characters moving their arms up and down to play the guitar, but nothing's actually happening.
I mean, I don't play piano, but I could tell when they were showing those close-ups of him hitting the keys that he was hitting like the right keys. Like they'd gone to that level of detail. Right, exactly.
I think that's really important, and I think
like in a lesser film, it would have cut like behind the piano and not even shown that.
Exactly that. It really helps immerse yourself in the story and the world that it's all trying to build.
I also really appreciated the way Jamie Foxx took on the role as Joe, because it didn't really feel like a celebrity performance at all. Jamie Foxx is obviously a very popular actor, and he has can have an incredibly distinct persona in a lot of the roles he's taken.
Absolutely.
But he also, I think he's quite underrated in the way in a lot of films that he can kind of, when needed, turn his own charisma down to a specific role and actually like inhabit a character. I've always thought his performance in Django was always quite underrated, because obviously he was sat next to a much more flashy actor, but the way he actually tones himself down shows like a level of restraint I feel like a lot of really egotistical actors probably wouldn't show, and like he does that exact thing here. And honestly, like I just immediately forgot it was Jamie Foxx, and he was by far my favorite performance in the film.
I would echo everything you said. I think he does like an immaculate job of blending into the character. And actually, because I sort of failed to do my reading before watching this film, I genuinely didn't know who it was for the longest time, and I think that speaks volumes. Because going off of that, like there are lots of good performances in this film. In fact, I can't really think of any bad ones, but there were distracting ones.
I wasn't a huge fan of Tina Fey.
I was gonna say, but the thing with that is Tina Fey was annoying, undoubtedly, but they make a point in the film of addressing how annoying her voice is. And it's one of those things, I think it comes down to personal preference, because it's like, if a film or a story makes it clear that you have an annoying character with annoying traits like an annoying voice, and then you find that character annoying, the film is kind of succeeded, but at the same time it doesn't make your enjoyment of the film any greater for having succeeded. If it succeeds at frustrating you, then it's still a negative. So for me, I was able to look past that, because I found the evolution of the character to be more gripping and more, distracting me away from the voice.
For me, it wasn't like her annoyingness as the performance, because I did get like that's what her character is. Like in the first sort of portion of the film where you're meeting her character, I actually thought she was kind of fun. It was more actually towards the later progression of the character where things get a bit more sort of serious that I felt kind of distracted by it, where it's sort of supposed to be a bit more emotional. I'm not saying her performance was bad, it's just that I feel like
it didn't live up to the others.
You could have had someone better, and like I didn't felt like she sold it brilliantly. I think her comedic chops are pretty good. Like a lot of the jokes that she has are not bad. Like she clearly like understood the character well. I'm not like hating on her. I don't think she was bad. I feel like you could have cast someone with more chemistry with Jamie Foxx.
She was a weak link in a strong cast, especially along someone doing such a good performance as Jamie Foxx. But there's some really interesting side characters and performances that I really wasn't expecting. So you had Richard Ayoade as one of the weird 2D interdimensional creatures. I think they're called Jerry. They all called themselves
called,
Jerry.
like, Jerry's,
and he plays one
right?
of them.
Yeah.
He's great because Richard Ayoade is great, but he has his voice, a very specific voice. And
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think every time he said a joke, I was like, that's great. Because I love his sense of humor, but
It's
it
Moss
is
from
just
the
him.
IT crowd.
It is just Moss from the IT crowd, and I'm like, I find it hard to get past that. And I had a similar thing with Graham Norton's in this film as well.
See, that I didn't find
the
distracting
weird-
because I've never really like watched Graham Norton particularly. So like when I found out it was him, when I checked back over the cast, I was like, that was Graham Norton. Fair enough.
Yeah,
Like that one honestly didn't bother me. I guess your mileage might vary with this because yeah, like I had no idea that was him.
I guess, yeah, maybe because I've seen more of his stuff. Like, it took me a couple of seconds to realise who it was. Maybe I'm being unfair because maybe it's once I realised who it was that kind of caught me off guard, and maybe I'm focusing on that more. Still really good performances from the two of them, and I think, yeah, particularly Graham Norton, because he does kind of puts more effort into sounding a bit different and fitting the role a bit better. But what I think my favourite of the side characters is Rachel House as Terry, who's this weird little antagonist creature. She does a great job in this film of just there's a really like incredibly dry humour, and in fact people like Richard Ayoade bring it as well. Like there's more of that kind of strange, irreverent British, Australian, Kiwi type humour in this than I've ever seen in like other Pixar films. There was a lot of sort of odd, unusual comedy.
I was a bit mixed on the humour in this film, to be honest. Like, there was some real funny jokes. I kind of like the bizarre references it was willing to go to, like some of the philosophers when they're doing that cutaway gag with 22. And yeah, there was some funny lines by Richard Ayoade because he'll just say something and I'll find it funny. Like, I don't really have high standards with that guy. He's just hilarious. I did find some of the jokes weren't really like landing for me, and I felt like the film was weirdly reliant on cutaway gags as a source of humour, particularly in the Great Before stuff in the film. I found there was a lot, even when they had like a scene that was essentially just dedicated to this, it felt kind of like it was kind of fucking with the pace of the film in a way, almost like a Family Guy. Not obviously this is much better than Family Guy, but like, you know how the very clear criticism of that show is the way they're constantly doing cutaway gags kind of ruins the flow of the film. And without doing spoilers, one of the most sort of interesting subplots of the film is essentially just resolved with a cutaway gag, which I found really disappointing.
I can't say I noticed that element of it. I certainly didn't find it affected the pace to me, but now you mention it, yeah, you're right, there is a lot of that sort of humor. I guess because it didn't affect the pace for me, I'd stopped noticing it, and I thought some of it worked. There's like a funny bit where two souls get mixed up and it goes, what happened to the other one, and then it like does like a brief cutaway to where that one ended up, and I found that like because of its suddenness it had like a kind of surprise value to it that kind of, I think
there were some good ones. I forget the particular philosopher they referenced. Is it like Foucault? I don't know how you say his name.
I'm sure they referenced Carl Jung.
That's it, Carl Jung. How fucking, that's such a strange reference for that one. Kind of caught me off guard.
That in my notes.
I thought that was so wild. I was like, what the fuck? Like that is explicitly a joke for adults. So that was kind of like, because no kid's going to be oh yes, Carl Jung. It was almost like boomer humour, but like kind of funny. The humour for me is not like a flat negative against the film. I just kind of had like mixed mileage with it. Do you think back to some of the older Pixar films, like Toy Story or The Incredibles, Toy Story 2? Those films are hilarious. They're so funny. And I just felt like this was of a lower standard for me personally, because I have very high standards when it comes to Pixar.
They continue to make like some of the best animated films out there, so you know it's right to have a high expectation when it comes to their new output. And I'd certainly say, you know, if you were to compare this to some of their more recent films like Onward that came out earlier last year, that was a real kind of flat line for me. I don't think you actually caught that one.
I have not, and I have very little interest in catching it. I saw the advert.
It's just a lot of like hit and miss at the moment. They had such a streak in the early noughties, like they couldn't do a wrong, and then suddenly, you know, Cars happened, and then everything got choppy from there on out. Particularly with like all the reliance on sequels and stuff. It's nice to see them come back with like really fresh, vibrant ideas. I think now is a good time to go on to spoiler talk about some of the intricate details of the plot. So, you know, if you haven't seen it, it's on Disney Plus. I'd recommend it. It's, you know, a really great, bubbly, visually interesting animated film.
I mean, I liked it less than you, but I'd still say I'd recommend it. You know, it's just so accessible, and I can't imagine that many people not at least liking it. So definitely watch it if you haven't seen it.
Right then, Rupert, tell me what you didn't like about this film, because so far you've skirted the issue.
Okay. I had really warmed up to this film when they come back to New York with the absolutely bizarre and not in the promotion at all thing of him going into a cat. So you have that whole section. You have basically all of my favourite parts of the film. You have the barbershop scene, you have the jazz club scene, and then you have the him at home playing his piano scene. Pretty much in a row, my absolute favourite parts of the film. If you like distilled that into like a 20-minute Pixar short, I could probably rate it like a 9 or a 10. But you then have the ending sequence, and that, like, I kind of felt the film kind of just like revving and veering, just trying to get to the end as quickly as it possibly could. With 22's, she loses her way as a soul, or something. I can't remember the exact mechanic of the film.
They established that there's the lost souls, where people become obsessed over specific things. They lose contact with, they lose touch with like ordinary life. It's a clever visual thing of them being kind of like in this sort of deserted area of the Great Before, where they're all like covered in sand and stuff like that.
Yeah, they kind of look like big monsters with tentacles. So anyways, he's playing the piano, really beautiful moment. He's sort of gone into like a meditative state, and his character arc is that he's had a kind of revelation. His life is not defined by, you know, one achievement. It's kind of defined by a multitude of experiences and things he's done. But this is after he's kind of told 22 that she has no purpose and she'll never have any purpose.
Essentially betrayed her, sort of.
Yeah, betrayed her. So the obvious arc for the film is that he then has to sacrifice himself for 22. That's what he does, essentially. He does this, 22 goes down to Earth, through this mechanic with this thing called the Earth Pass. I'm not going to explain. This is probably one of the most mechanically complicated Pixar films there are, even more so than Inside Out.
That's true.
So he does the right thing, and I was really like kind of impressed by the film at this point, and I was thinking like, wow, is he gonna like die? Is he gonna like kind of accept, you know, his original fate? I was thinking like, is this film gonna end with him like going into the great beyond or whatever? Like, Jesus Christ,
that would be so heavy deep.
And then like, I can see why they didn't want to commit to that, because that's a pretty dark thing for a kids film to have, and I can see why why it maybe would be kind of inappropriate as an ending. But I thought that's kind of where the film is naturally leading to. And then out of nowhere, like one of the Jerrys kind of goes, "We're gonna give you a second chance. You can just go back and be alive again." And it just felt to me like such a cheap way of writing themselves out of that arc, despite the fact that thematically the film had kind of completely built to that, and then they just kind of, they want to have their cake and eat it. They don't want to, they want to get the emotions out of you to lead to that point, but then they don't want to actually go to that dark place. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, they don't want to upset their audience too much and not have them watch the film again, or, you know, because it's got that family branding to it. You can't push the envelope too far, otherwise you will risk alienating people. And you know what, to kind of further confirm that point, that it does feel kind of like a move from the writers to avoid being too sad, the ending kind of ends on a strange note of him walking out of his house and then, you know, saying, "Oh, I'm gonna take every moment and you know, seize the day," type thing. But it does kind of feel like a sort of empty platitude at the end of like an otherwise quite poignant and personal journey. It feels vague and then kind of ends on like an awkward offbeat, where it's like, it feels like it's either going to go somewhere further or it should have ended earlier.
The ending at the piano is such a natural culmination of like what's happened in the film before, and then there's just this kind of awkward epilogue that just doesn't really follow through with what they've built up to. And the thing I was talking about earlier, the whole thing with Terry, where he notices the count is off because for some reason Jamie Foxx's character, for plot reasons, like he's the only person who's ever died and then not wanted to die, I guess, and he escapes, which was kind of questionable. I mean, I'll allow it, but he notices the count is off, and then there's this subplot of him kind of chasing Jamie Foxx's character to try and get him back. It kind of just leads to nothing. It's kind of offhandedly just kind of, "Oh, look over there," and then he like changes the abacus.
Oh, and it's like, true.
And it's like, right. Wow, there's you no kind
consequence to it at all.
Like the plot, that it almost, that kind of B plot just almost has like no impact on the film. I know there's the one bit where Jamie Foxx and Tina Fey, they're in the sort of underground, and then he kind of pops up and takes 22 back. And I think that's pretty much the only purpose he serves. So I was really disappointed by that sort of B plot as well, and its resolution felt just being a cutaway gag. Like in the last, I'm not even kidding, like almost the last 60 seconds of the film, like it really bothered me.
No, you know what? That's quite a big flaw that I hadn't really properly paid attention to. I think I was drawn in enough by other elements of the film where the ending, I did feel the ending was off, and I think you've kind of articulated why that is, and I'm starting to understand that a bit better now. But I think for me that the thing that really struck me about this film is just its powerful themes and its great sort of character study of Joe. One I find quite personally affecting because he's a failed musician, and as an aspiring musician who's convinced he's gonna be a failed musician in the near future, it's kind of this horrible flash forward. Many creative types, I'm sure, will kind of relate to the film in a similar way, that kind of horrible sense of like, and even people who aren't actually, that sense of like ennui, you know, like I've come to this point in my life and I don't feel like I've achieved enough. And
no,
then
I did
suddenly
really enjoy that.
Your time's cut short. And in that way, it's almost like a sort of animated version of It's a Wonderful Life.
Oh, right, yeah. That's a good comparison,
Because the pivotal point of the film is when they go back to Earth. He's in the cat, and Tina Fey is in him, and so she's like a diehard cynic, but because she's now experiencing the world properly for the first time, instead of just sort of hearing about it, she starts loving things, and he, in a strange way, he's sort of being shown himself in a mirror living his life without having the consequence of, or you know, that actually being responsible for it. And it leads him to some like really great personal revelations that, like we mentioned earlier, his life isn't solely defined by his aspirations and dreams as a musician. He is not just a musician, he is a person, you know, of all these experiences, and there's a personality underneath it, a soul, and he's neglected that. And a scene you mentioned in another one, the barbershop scene, and then the scene with his mother, where he finally starts opening up to people about more than just,
well, he's not opening
his
up.
passion.
22 is opening up.
Well,
exactly.
Okay, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, which is kind of important. It's poignant and also kind of tragic in its own way, because he can't do it himself. He's so like divorced from like
the moment
the real
he actually
world.
has the inspiration to, the moment he has like the actual impetus and the actual words are coming to him, he can't do it. He has to like kind of, he sat there as a cat meowing at 22, who's the only one who understands him. So weird.
Which I think is genuinely like genuinely emotionally affecting. It's really quite powerful. He like sort of discovers his barber he's been seeing for years is not actually like a, you know, diehard dedicated barber. He's a real person that has his own story. He talks to his mum. He opens up to his mum, who he just thought was trying to keep him down because she didn't believe in him, but actually she was just trying to protect him from like a vicious world that was cruel to his father, who no longer in the film, can only be assumed that he's passed on. So like she's like the only person looking out for him. And you know, all those things, like, I know Pixar are kind of frequently guilty of trying to like emotionally manipulate the audience and pluck at the heartstrings, which is one of the reasons I didn't particularly like Inside Out as much as many people did, because I found it quite emotionally manipulative and I didn't really connect with it in any meaningful way. This film, I feel, as we mentioned, similar concept kind of in reverse, really did grip me and you know, manipulate me. I did really feel like it for all these situations.
I definitely got more of an emotional reaction out of this than I did Inside Out. I agree with you there. But what the film tries to sell as the emotional climax is him and 22 falling to earth, but he's gonna fall back up. That I felt kind of cheaped out at that point.
I would describe the ending as kind of perfunctory. It kind of served a purpose rather than being like innately ingrained in what the story had been building up to before. Like it didn't feel like the character of 22 would suddenly go into this place. Like they spent, like they say, like thousands of years refusing to go down to earth, and then they have their shot and they suddenly become you know, a lost soul. It feels like a convenient way of having the ending come faster.
I think my problem is I could kind of sense that they weren't going to commit to it when they were doing that falling stuff. So maybe it's just my own cynicism kind of ruining it for me. I also don't appreciate this film implies that cats have no souls.
No, that's not true, because that's the cutaway gag I was referring to that I found quite funny, is when he accidentally ends up in the soul of the cat, he's like, where's the cat's soul? And then it's just the cat sat on like the escalator to like heaven going meow.
Oh,
that's it.
Fuck.
That's the whole gag.
That.
And I found that tickled me, because there was a kind of tragedy to like, oh fuck, that cat's dead. Like, what the fuck happens to the cat?
Man, I completely forgot about that. Fair enough, you know, Pixar, I take it back. 10 out of 10. Great film.
Right, so after all that, Rupert, what do you reckon you'd give it?
I would give this a nice decent 6 out of 10. I have like such a high standard when I go into a Pixar film, even with their off streak as of late with, you know, The Good Dinosaur and onwards and whatever. But I did enjoy it. There are a lot of elements of it, like I said, that I really loved. I just feel like the core narrative of the film, which ultimately is like the most important thing, the actual storyline, felt very cheap in points and also didn't really wrap up in a conclusive way, which was almost more frustrating because individual moments in the film and individual scenes were so good and I liked them so much. It frustrated me even more to be so emotionally invested in one scene and, you know, absolutely loving a lot of the technical elements, and then to have these kind of cheap narrative elements kind of drag it down. It was more frustrating.
Fair enough. I'd give it an 8. I think it succeeds in all the ways a good Pixar film should succeed. It had this great emotional resonance. It was sort of artistically unique, different, a beautiful thing to look at, full of clever writing, full of, you know, clever humor, and a fantastic family film in so much as it has like genuinely poignant messages for both the young and the old, you know, like don't focus in on such specific parts of your life, you know, be a reflective, active participant in your life. Don't get lost, essentially. And it's beautiful in that way, but it's also really quite sort of harrowing in other ways. Like it's really kind of heartbreaking. It got me, you know. Normally I am like a tired cynic when it comes to a lot of films, but Pixar tends to have a way of puncturing through that, getting underneath. Yeah, this is one of my favorite films of last year, maybe even my favorite so far. Will have to it remains to be seen. Also, I was thinking would be a nice thing to do for the channel is we've both got Letterboxd accounts. I was thinking we should do a little list on there of all of the films that we've rated, and we'll do like a sort of an average rating by combining the two scores. If Rupert fucking hates a film and I love it, he gives it a 1, plummet, I give it a 10. Average out, it's a 5, and it goes halfway down the fucking list, you know. Yeah,
there you go. That would be good,
it's
actually.
A democracy. If I've done that by the time this video comes out, we'll have that in the description, and you can check out all of the films with links to all of our other reviews. And yeah, that's been our review of Soul.
Check it out.
There it is.
Give Disney some more money. I've heard they're pretty strapped for cash at the
They're
moment.
pretty strapped for cash right now. All right, peace.